Hello aviation fans! We have come a long way through the history and model lines of many aviation programs, large and small. Meanwhile, getting acquainted with all these machines, you can see that behind each of them there is some kind of strategy, a certain technical task and plan, the implementation of which should make the plane and its manufacturer successful. At the sight of our today's hero, the question immediately arises: what kind of plan could make the aviators realize such a strange project? Let's get acquainted with an unusual and very interesting aircraft that has become a very successful milestone and the end of the era of the epic aviation industry of the misty Albion. British Aerospace 146, or the BAE 146, in the second generation also known as the Avro RJ, is a original passenger jet airliner created in the early 1980s and manufactured mainly by the British Aerospace Corporation. The aircraft was produced in several versions, past the change of generations, and was delivered in the amount of 387 units. Not bad for a 4-engine high-wing regional airliner. A 4-engine regional jet. Why? Let's find out. The history of this project, which later received an index 146, began in the glorious 1970s. At that time, British aviation companies were considering various ways of further development in an increasingly fierce competition. Beside the pressure from the American companies, now there was also the United European Airbus, so no one was planning to create something big, and any fantasies were being stopped by the memories of failure of the Vickers VC-10 project. Therefore, aviators looked into the market of regional transportation, by airplanes of small capacity. Neither Boeing, nor Douglas, nor Airbus claimed this market, which is already a good sign. There were mostly outdated aircraft, more than 1,000 turboprops that needed to be replaced. Hawker Siddeley were the most active here. They had already been working on this topic for a long time. Besides, one of these aging turboprops was the HS-748, which was in fact created by them and required replacement. The experience of failures in previous British aviation programs showed that these failures were caused not as much by technical problems as by an unsuccessful strategy. Their planes, going after the leadership in the world, in practice could not handle the competition. It was simply wrong marketing. So this time, they decided to study the market and industry in order to understand what plane is needed, to understand very clearly. Aviators conducted large-scale studies, interviewing more than 60 airlines around the world, and learned that an optimal choice would be a 70-seat regional plane. Potential demand for them would reach almost 1,500 units by the mid-1980s, and their competitors would be the Fokker F-28 and, in some cases, the Boeing 737 and Douglas DC-9, but even then from the secondary market and with a lot of reservations. The second condition was a jet power plant. Turboprops could no longer be justified. But this was also a problem, because the turboprops, despite their shortcomings, provided excellent takeoff and landing performance that needed to be preserved. Many potential customers were in Africa, Asia and South America, and their airfields were not the best in the world. Plus the plane, from the get-go, had to have the potential of turning into a freighter. It would expand the demand. Another condition was the maximum optimization of operations, regarding both the passengers and cargo, as well as maintenance. These were the reasons why, when designing an airplane, they almost immediately abandoned the seemingly obvious low-wing layout with engines in the tail, in favor of the not-so-obvious high-wing layout with engines under the wing. The fact is that the classic design assumed that passengers would enter and exit mainly through a door in the front of the fuselage, and this slowed down the process. There was no second door in the back, the engines were there. In addition, the aircraft was assumed to have a cargo option, and with engines in the tail it would be difficult to develop, although as we know it is possible. Plus, the high-wing layout could give better takeoff and landing performance, which is important for customers. Another advantage, engines suspended under the wing are good for the maintenance. They are high enough not to be afraid of foreign debris, and low enough to be easily accessed. There it is, in front of you. Thus, the HS-146 project became a high-wing T-tail jet airliner. The next obvious question is, why 4? A jet engine is a complex, heavy structure that requires attention and maintenance. The installation of more powerful engines is more optimal than increasing their number, and of course, the fuel consumption can be decreased. This is one of the reasons why 4-engine airliners are going extinct in our time. So what's the deal here? The aircraft received the promising Avro Lycoming 502 engine, easy to maintain, economical and quiet. The problem was in its thrust, 31 kilonewtons. 2 would not be enough. It was possible to build a trijet, but such a scheme would complicate the structure, and this was critical. It was estimated that the advantages of engines would compensate their number. They were very easy to maintain, due to the lower load the resource would be high, and the thrust-to-weight ratio is high too, which is good for an airplane with a bunch of special requirements. Does that sound convincing? Well, at that time there were no sufficiently promising engines, and there was no money for modification, and especially the creation of something just for this aircraft. As a result, they came to a logical conclusion. Let there be 4 of them under the wing. With such an unusual but interesting package, Hawker Siddeley came to the UK government. They did not have enough money for full implementation, and the practice of state support in the United Kingdom was quite classic. They were not disappointed. The government agreed to provide 50% of the funding for further work. But it didn't go well for long. In 1973, the oil crisis began. Fuel prices jumped almost 4 times in a short period, and the 4-engine scheme rebelled against its owner. In 1974, the HS-146 project was about to be shut down. It was an epic battle between many structures with opposing positions. Some were saying that because of the high consumption of expensive fuel, no one would need such a plane, and it would never pay back the expenses that were only growing. Others defended it, stating that with its performance it had no direct competitors and would be in demand. In addition, it was a matter of national pride. Great Britain, a great aviation power, at that moment had only one completely its own airplane project. To close it now and to ruin the already barely living Hawker Siddeley,
shame on them!
As a result, the project was officially frozen, but the work was continued within the walls of the company with limited support from authorities. But it didn't help the Hawkers. On the verge of collapse in 1978, they were nationalized and became a part of British Aerospace, which resumed the project, naming it BAE 146. The new corporation vividly presented the advantages of the aircraft design: excellent flight performance, environmental friendliness and silence. Even then, the world paid attention to the excessive noise of airplanes, and the 4-engine scheme allowed to maintain minimum thrust, making flights quieter, an excellent replacement for the roaring turboprops. Finally, things started going well, and the airlines, realizing that the plane will be released, began ordering it. The assembly of prototypes started at the Hatfield plant north of London, the former de Havilland site. Finally, in September 1981, the first prototype made its maiden flight, and soon 2 more aircraft joined it. Tests and certification began. The flight performance of the aircraft was impressive, and the noise level in all modes was minimal, of which British Aerospace did not forget to remind. They planned to sell more than 300 planes, while stating that 250 units would be enough to fully pay off the expenses. The BAE 146 certification was completed in the early 1983. Well, since we've already met the plane, it's time to look at it closer. According to the general scheme, BAE 146 is an aircraft with a high-located low-sweep wing, 4 engines suspended on pylons, and a T-tail. A classic scheme for cargo planes, but it was also fitting here. The plane and all of its elements were created on the balance of maximum simplicity of design, the best flight performance and economy. Everything excessive was discarded. In addition, the aircraft was created taking into account the mass production elements, the already existing parts and other things. This allowed the operators to reduce maintenance costs. In terms of simplifying the design, engineers were actively working with the wing, assembled from a minimum number of parts. Fortunately, the experience of creating the Airbus A300 wings turned out to be useful. Mechanization took some balancing too. The low-sweep wing was equipped with quite large Fowler flaps throughout almost the entire length of the trailing edge, and the remaining space was occupied by ailerons, plus the interceptors. This was enough to ensure controllability and low minimum speeds. Enough. The aircraft was not equipped with slats, one hefty mechanism less. The tail of the aircraft is quite classic, T-shaped, without any complicated bonuses except for one, which I will talk about a little later. The ideology of building a landing gear for a jet aircraft of this scheme is classic, 3 legs. The main gear is hidden inside the fairing at the bottom of the fuselage. All legs were equipped with 2-wheeled bogies, quite simple and durable, and also with carbon brakes. A fashionable bonus. At the Concorde, they showed themselves very well. Engines. Avro Lycoming ALF 502. A classic for our time turbofan with a high bypass ratio, for its time very advanced and popular. In addition to the BAE 146, they were also applied on the Canadian Challenger jets. The feature of these engines was the ability to reduce the fan rotation speed, with a significant reduction in noise level. The reduction in thrust was compensated by the number of engines. This made the ALF 502 on the BAE 146 record quiet. The plane turned out to be very handy for airports located close to or inside cities, where noise regulation is tight. They did not forget about simplifying the design and maintenance. The ALF 502 was one of the earliest representatives of modular power plants, parts of which were easily replaced. In addition, the engines are not equipped with reverse thrust. Braking was being performed by interceptors, wheel brakes, and another bonus of the aircraft, a huge aerodynamic brake made up of 2 vertical flaps. Also in the tail, an auxiliary power unit was being installed optionally, as British Aerospace boasted, incredibly lightweight, economical, and reliable. All of this together technically gave the indicators that the British were counting on. The basic BAE 146 weighed about 38 tons, had a range of more than 3,500 kilometers or 1,900 miles, and speeds of about 750 kilometers per hour or 404 knots. Not very high, but not bad for a regional plane, especially since it was replacing mainly turboprops flying even slower. Besides, the takeoff and landing performance was good. The necessary runway length was less than 1,200 meters or 4,000 feet, whereas most of jet airliners required almost twice as much. Let's look inside. The BAE 146 received a cabin 342 centimeters or 11.2 feet wide. A huge width, wider than a DC-9 cabin for example, and the mid-range Boeing 737, a plane from another league, has a cabin wider by only 5 inches. All this space allowed the operators to play around with seating schemes. The usual layout suggested a 3+2 scheme, as it should be for the originals, but sometimes we can find cabins with 6 seats, 3+3, an unusual method of compressing the layout. The cockpit is designed for 2 pilots and can probably be considered the most ordinary part of the aircraft. Standard set of equipment and standard layout. It's even somewhat unusual for British airplanes, often filled with all the features that can be found in the industry. Okay, let's see what options were offered. The very first modification was the BAE 146-100, which was the one that took off in 1981, and in 1983 was transferred to the fleet of the domestic Dan Air. It was a basic board, accommodating 70 passengers in a single-class layout and up to 82 maximum, and had a range of approximately 3,800 kilometers, or 2,000 miles. Plus, on the basis of the 100, several government modifications were created to transport the country's leaders, and of course, Queen Elizabeth, a big fan of aviation. The second major option was the BAE 146-200. It received a stretched fuselage, capacity of up to 100 passengers, an increased takeoff mass, and a little shorter range, minus 200 kilometers. Nothing comes for free. It appeared almost immediately. The first flight was in 1982, when the basic model was still being certified. The largest one was the BAE 146-300. The aircraft was announced at the Farnborough Air Show in 1984, when 2 of its brothers were already flying. The fuselage was stretched again, which allowed to increase the capacity to 112 passengers. Yes, in terms of dimensions, it was almost like the Airbus A220-100, not such a baby. The weight of this one is already 44 tons, although the range is the smallest in the family, approximately 3,300 kilometers or 1,800 miles. Naturally, the freighter potential was not lost. All models had the Quiet Trader QT modifications, equipped with large cargo doors on the side of the fuselage behind the wing. So, Dan Air got its first plane in 1983. Their planes were flying mostly from London to Europe, using not the main airports but the less loaded regional ones. Then the planes went to the United States and then to other countries around the world. The aircraft was loved by regional carriers. Its takeoff and landing performance and low noise level allowed the operators to easily adjust routes, flying to more airports. In 1987, the plane was given permission to fly to the London City Airport. For some time, it was almost the only commercial jet airliner that could fly there without restrictions. The popularity on regional lines was also added by the fact that the aircraft was performing very well on short routes with different traffic densities. The reliable and maintainable design, coupled with a high resource power plant, made it possible to drive the aircraft all day with a large number of flights, and the 60 to 70% passenger load provided good profitability. But it was necessary to move forward, and it was done. Yes, Boeing was not the only one to be developing the next generations. In the early 1990s, British Aerospace carried out a large-scale modernization program and released, technically, the second generation of airplanes. They were almost completely similar to the basic ones, but due to introduction of innovations, optimization, upgraded engines and avionics with a new glass cockpit, they became more efficient in operation. Names were also changed. In 1992, the parent corporation underwent reorganization, and the original airliners business was transferred into the separate Avro Original Jets company, which is why the BAE is now called Avro RJ. So, the name BAE 146-100 was replaced by Avro RJ 70-200 by RJ 85, and the Model 300 respectively became RJ 100. The aircraft were in good demand in the 90s. Despite the seemingly strange layout, aviators produced 166 second-generation planes, in addition to 221 of the first. But even then, the pressure was getting too serious. At least the Brazilian and Canadian regional jets were pushing hard. Other aircraft modifications were also planned: the heavier RJ-115, the third-generation RJX, and many other versions. There was even a plan to create a twin-engine model. The airplane is also not leaving the scene of technological progress. A few years ago, the BAE 146 was chosen as a flying lab to test the concept of a hybrid aircraft power plant. The idea of Airbus, Rolls-Royce and Siemens is to replace one of the engines, yes, when there are 4 of them at once it is much simpler, with an electric motor. Meanwhile, the 2 megawatt engine will not be working purely on the battery, like a Tesla, but will be powered by batteries and a generator. In theory, all of this, called the EFAN X, should take off soon. But this is a flying lab, not a classic transport. Most of the projects did not reach production, and Avro limited themselves to upgrading of existing aircraft. Such work is still relevant, the planes continue to fly. It didn't go without incidents. The planes of this family were participants in 14 disasters, with the death of 294 people, plus one, I'm not sure it can be called a terrorist attack. In 1987, on board the Pacific Southwest, a fired employee attacked the crew with a gun, captured the cockpit and threw the plane into a dive. The airliner crashed into the ground at a supersonic speed. No one on board survived. By the beginning of the 21st century, it became clear that the era of BAE 146 and Avro RJ is coming to an end. The aircraft performed very well in the 1980s, was quite competitive in the 1990s, but the emergence of a new generation of regional jet airliners drove it out of the market. Demand fell to zero, and modernization plans were not realized. As a result, in 2001, Avro closed the production. A total of 387 BAE 146 and Avro RJ airplanes were assembled. The figure is not particularly impressive, but the program itself was initially not very expensive, so it did pay off and can be considered, although not breakthrough, but quite successful. In addition, despite the obsolescence, airlines are not in a hurry to get rid of these airplanes. In the beginning of 2020, about 90 aircraft continue to fly around the world. Successful solutions and short takeoff and landing capabilities are holding the aircraft in the sky. Another veteran that is leaving the service but remains in our memory. Well, soon we will return to something modern and inspiring. And for now, subscribe to the channel not to miss this return. Fast flights and soft landings to you.